During a wedding, the priest noticed something strange about the bride and suddenly stopped the ceremony. The guest froze in shock, and the groom couldn't believe his eyes. Don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and write in the comments. Where are you watching this video from? The early afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the church's stained glass windows, painting the wooden pews in a mosaic of color. Guests murmured in hushed voices, adjusting their attire and glancing towards the grand entrance. The air was thick with expectation, as all weddings tended to be, filled with a blend of excitement, nerves, and the quiet solemnity of a moment that would change lives forever. Father Michael stood at the altar, hands folded before him, observing the gathering with the practiced eye of a man who had seen many unions take shape within these walls. He had officiated weddings of every kind, joyous celebrations, practical arrangements, and even those tinged with sorrow, where love had become something uncertain. But today he felt something different in the air, something he could not yet name. Thomas, the groom, stood tall in his tailored suit, his expression an uneasy mixture of happiness and restraint. He was a man deeply in love, yet acutely aware of the weight of this day. His fingers adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt, an unconscious gesture of nerves he had been unable to shake. He smiled at a friend who whispered something encouraging, but Father Michael saw the flicker of tension in his face, the way his eyes darted to the entrance, awaiting the woman who would soon become his wife. The church was nearly full. Friends and distant relatives lined the rows, all eager to witness the ceremony. There was laughter, quiet exchanges, the rustling of fabric as people settled into their seats. Yet, amidst the light-hearted atmosphere, there was an undercurrent of something more restrained. At the very front, seated with perfect posture and an air of controlled composure, were Robert and Elizabeth, Thomas's parents. Their presence was commanding, their expressions unreadable. Robert sat with his hands folded across his lap, his gaze fixed ahead with an unrelenting sternness, while Elizabeth's lips remained pressed into a thin line, betraying nothing of her thoughts. Unlike the rest of the guests who whispered and turned toward the entrance with anticipation, neither of them so much as glanced in that direction. Then the music began. A hush fell over the crowd as the doors at the far end of the church opened, and Amanda stepped inside. She was radiant. Her gown, elegant in its simplicity, flowed effortlessly around her as she moved forward, bouquet in hand. The delicate veil framed her face, but even through its soft lace, her beauty was undeniable. The room exhaled collectively, enchanted by the sight of her. Yet, Father Michael, standing at the altar with the groom, did not focus on the admiration that swept through the church. He was watching something else entirely. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Most weddings carried a certain rhythm. The entrance of the bride was met with murmurs of approval, a quiet sigh from relatives, the shifting of bodies as people leaned forward to get a better look. But this silence was different. It was sharp-edged, unnatural. And then he saw the looks. Not from Thomas. His face was open with love, his posture tense with anticipation. Not from the friends and family who truly wished them well, but from certain others in the crowd. A murmur passed between two older guests in the second row, their words hidden but their disapproving expressions clear. A younger woman pursed her lips and looked away, as if embarrassed to witness something inappropriate. And then there were the groom's parents. Robert remained still, his features carved from stone, but Elizabeth, her fingers twitched where they rested on her lap. It was the only sign of movement, yet it spoke volumes. Her gaze did not soften as Amanda approached, did not waver in any sign of joy or welcome. Instead, there was something else there, something that made Father Michael's skin prickle with unease. It was not sadness. It was not mere skepticism or protectiveness. It was rejection. Amanda walked with grace, her smile gentle yet controlled. But as she neared the altar, Father Michael noticed the small signs of tension. Her grip on the bouquet was firm, her knuckles slightly whitened. There was a stiffness in her shoulders, as though she carried a weight unseen by anyone else in the room. She was not nervous in the way most brides were. She was bracing herself. And suddenly, Father Michael understood. This was not just the weight of marriage, of stepping into a new life. This was the weight of being unwelcome in the eyes of people who should have celebrated this day with her. His heart tightened. He had seen many things in his years, but few as cruel as the quiet kind of exclusion, the one that came not with open hostility but with cold detachment. Amanda stopped before Thomas, who reached for her hands. The moment their fingers touched, something in her eased just slightly. She looked at him, and there was love in her gaze, a warmth that softened the stiffness in her expression. But Father Michael knew, even before a word was spoken, that there were forces in this room determined to tear this union apart. He did not yet know how, but he knew that before the ceremony was complete, something would go terribly wrong. As Amanda took her place beside Thomas, the hush in the church deepened. It was not the reverent silence that often accompanied such moments, the kind filled with the collective anticipation of vows exchanged, of promises made. No, this silence felt weighted, strained, as if the very air had thickened with the unspoken thoughts of those present. Father Michael had stood at this altar countless times before, had seen brides and grooms of every disposition, some radiant with uncontained joy, others trembling with nerves, some with the quiet solemnity of those who understood the gravity of the commitment they were making. But there was something different about Amanda's presence, something he could not quite put into words. He watched her closely, though he took care not to let his scrutiny show. Her movements were poised, practiced, but just beneath that elegance was an unmistakable stiffness, a tension that had nothing to do with nerves. It was in the way she held the bouquet, not merely as an accessory to complete her bridal image, but as something to anchor her grip a fraction too tight. It was in the way she stood, not merely awaiting the ceremony, but preparing herself for something unseen. And then there were her eyes. Even through the delicate veil that framed her face, Father Michael could see it, a certain guardedness, a wariness that should not have been present on a day meant for joy. She was smiling, yes, and from a distance, she must have looked like any other bride standing at the threshold of a new life. But he saw the small hesitations, the subtle shifts in expression when she glanced at the crowd. That was when he looked beyond the couple and into the faces of those gathered. Most of the guests were smiling, their expressions reflecting the significance of the day. Friends of the bride and groom looked on with warmth, their joy unclouded. But not all. A handful of guests sat stiffly, their gazes cold and unwavering. A woman in a pastel dress whispered something to her husband, who shook his head in quiet disapproval. A man into the third row, likely a distant relative, had his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his mouth pressed into a thin, disapproving line. These were not expressions of casual indifference or unfamiliarity. These were expressions of silent judgment. Then his gaze fell upon Robert and Elizabeth. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them looked as though they were about to witness the moment their only son would pledge his life to another. They sat as still as statues, Robert's hands folded in his lap, Elizabeth's fingers clenched so tightly that the skin around her knuckles had paled. It was not sadness. It was not even quiet contemplation. It was rejection. Father Michael had seen that expression before, on the faces of fathers who disapproved of their daughters' chosen husbands, of mothers who believed their sons had made a mistake. But this was different. This was not the disappointment of parents who thought their child had chosen poorly. This was something deeper, something uglier. They did not see Amanda as part of their family. The realization settled over him like a weight, and suddenly, so many of the day's unspoken tensions made sense. Amanda knew. She had known from the beginning. It explained the way she held herself, the way she measured her steps, the way she braced herself each time her gaze swept over the front row. She had come here knowing that she was not wanted by the very people who should have welcomed her. Father Michael had officiated unions that had been challenged before, by ex-lovers who objected at the last moment, by feuding families, even by those who doubted the couple's compatibility. But this was something else entirely. This was prejudice cloaked in civility, intolerance masked as concern. And in the center of it stood Amanda, standing beside the man she loved, trying with quiet dignity to ignore what was being withheld from her. His stomach tightened with unease. He could not, in good conscience, begin this ceremony without certainty. Certainty that this woman, who had entered this church knowing the weight of unspoken judgment, was stepping into this marriage with the full assurance that she was doing so freely, without hesitation, without coercion. A moment later, as if fate had aligned with his thoughts, he saw Robert move. The older man leaned toward the aisle, his lips parting, his expression unreadable. Then he rose. Without a word, he stepped away from his seat and strode toward the altar. The movement sent a ripple through the gathered guests. Heads turned. Murmurs swelled, soft at first, then louder as people exchanged confused glances. Elizabeth did not try to stop him. She merely watched, her hands still tight in her lap, as if she had expected this moment all along. Amanda went still. Father Michael glanced at Thomas, who was staring at his father in open confusion. The tension in the air was no longer subtle. It had thickened into something unmistakable, something unavoidable. Robert stopped just short of the altar. Then, in a voice that carried through the church, calm and unwavering, he said, "This wedding cannot continue." The silence that followed was deafening. For a brief moment, the church remained frozen in silence, as if time itself had stalled at the weight of Robert's words. The air felt thick, pressing in on every person present, holding them captive in the sudden rupture of what should have been an unshakable ceremony. Amanda's breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening around the bouquet as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the reality of this moment. Thomas, standing beside her, barely concealed the shock that flickered across his face. His father's voice had carried through the grand hall with such finality that it felt almost as if an irrevocable decision had already been made. Father Michael watched as Robert stood firm, his posture unyielding, his gaze steady, daring anyone to challenge him. The murmur of voices began to swell among the guests, hushed whispers spreading like wildfire, uncertainty and discomfort creeping into the congregation. People exchanged glances, some with confusion, others with apprehension, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak. Thomas was the first to move, his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as he turned to his father, his expression caught between disbelief and growing anger. But before he could utter a word, Robert raised a hand, commanding attention once more. "This wedding cannot continue," he repeated, his voice unwavering, each syllable deliberate, as though he had carefully rehearsed them. "Not like this." Father Michael, who had seen many weddings take unexpected turns, took a slow breath, steadying himself before stepping forward. "Robert," he said carefully, measuring his words, "this is a serious claim. I cannot, in good faith, halt a ceremony without understanding why." A flicker of something unreadable passed over Robert's face. He hesitated, if only for a fraction of a second, before turning his gaze to the priest. "I have reason to believe that Amanda's intentions in this marriage are not honest," he said, his tone composed, almost calculated. "I have evidence that she is not marrying my son for love, but for financial security." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Amanda's face drained of color, her breath coming short and sharp as she stared at Robert in stunned silence. It was as though she had been struck, though there had been no physical blow. Thomas stiffened. "That's absurd," he said, his voice a mixture of incredulity and rising fury. "Where is this coming from?" But Robert did not look at his son. Instead, he kept his focus on Father Michael, as though addressing anyone else would be beneath him. "My wife and I have taken precautions," he continued. "We've had Amanda's background investigated." Another wave of murmurs swept through the church, the words slithering between the pews like an encroaching storm. Father Michael's frown deepened. He had encountered resistance from families before, disapproving parents, feuding relatives, but there was something unnervingly methodical about the way Robert presented his argument, as though this was not an impulsive reaction, but a well-prepared intervention. "We have seen evidence of her family's financial troubles," Robert pressed on. "They are not stable, not secure. My son has worked hard for his career, for his future, and I refuse to let him throw it away on a woman who— That is enough." Thomas's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp as a blade. Amanda remained motionless, her fingers trembling slightly against the bouquet she still held. It was the only sign of emotion she allowed herself. Father Michael took another step forward, placing himself slightly between Robert and the couple. "Robert," he said, his voice remaining calm but firm, "financial differences do not determine the validity of a marriage. Love does." Robert's lips pressed into a thin line. "Love does not change reality," he countered. "She is not on equal footing with my son. This marriage will not be built on balance." Amanda inhaled sharply, her composure cracking ever so slightly. Father Michael turned to her, his expression softening, but his question was direct. "Amanda, do you have anything to say?" She lifted her chin, steadying herself before she spoke. "I did not come here to prove my worth," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. "I came here to marry the man I love. If that isn't enough, then nothing I say will change his father's mind." The room remained silent. Father Michael studied her carefully, taking in the steadiness of her posture, the raw honesty in her words. He had been a priest long enough to recognize sincerity when he heard it, but before he could speak again, another voice entered the fray. "I told you this would happen," Elizabeth's voice rang out, controlled yet cold. "We should have stopped this long before today." All eyes turned to the groom's mother. She had remained seated throughout the exchange, but now she rose slowly, her expression unreadable yet heavy with meaning. "She will never belong in our family," she said simply. And with that, the truth was finally spoken. A heavy silence followed, deeper than any that had preceded it. Father Michael felt the weight of those words settle over the room, suffocating and irreversible. The issue had never been about money. It had never been about financial security. It had always been about something much darker. Amanda did not flinch, but the silence that followed was more deafening than any protest she could have made. Robert remained motionless, his gaze unreadable. Thomas's face was a storm of emotion, rage and hurt twisting together. Father Michael exhaled slowly, realization settling deep into his bones. This wedding was no longer a matter of simple vows. It was a battleground. A thick silence settled over the church, heavier than before, more suffocating. It was not the kind of quiet that followed a moment of reverence or contemplation. It was the silence of exposed truth, of something raw and undeniable spilling into a space where it was never meant to be spoken aloud. Father Michael stood still, his hands clasped before him as he absorbed the weight of what had just been said. He had suspected, of course. From the moment Amanda had walked down the aisle, from the moment he had seen the glances exchanged in the crowd, the stiffness in Robert's posture, the cold detachment in Elizabeth's eyes, he had known there was something unspoken beneath their disapproval. But to hear it spoken so plainly, without hesitation or shame, made it all the more horrifying. "She will never belong in our family." The words echoed in his mind, chilling in their finality. Amanda had not reacted, not outwardly, at least. She stood with her shoulders squared, her hands still clutching the bouquet, her expression carefully composed. But her silence was telling. Not the silence of someone caught off guard, but the silence of someone who had expected this moment, who had long braced for it. Father Michael looked to Thomas. The young man stood rigid beside his bride, his features taut, his breath shallow. He had grown up in this church, in this community, raised by parents who were seen as pillars of tradition, of discipline, of order. And yet, in this moment, he looked like a man on the verge of breaking apart, like something fundamental inside him had been fractured. Father Michael had known Thomas since he was a boy. He had baptized him, had watched him grow into a man with an independent mind, someone who had built his own path in life. He had thought Thomas was ready for this commitment, that his love for Amanda was solid and unwavering. But was he ready to face what stood between them now? The priest let out a quiet breath, his gaze shifting back to Robert and Elizabeth. The way they sat, rigid, unmoving, reminded him of statues, as if their refusal to yield made them more powerful. They did not look ashamed. They did not falter beneath the weight of the silence that had swallowed the church whole. To them, this was not cruelty. This was certainty. And that was what unsettled Father Michael most of all. "Robert," his voice was steady, though he felt the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. "You came to me with concerns about Amanda's intentions. You spoke of financial matters, of balance, and yet your wife has just made it clear that money was never the true concern." Robert did not immediately respond. His fingers flexed slightly, his lips parting just enough to let out a measured breath. "Money is part of it," he said finally, his tone careful, as though choosing his words with precision. "But there are other factors, things that cannot be ignored." Amanda let out a quiet, humorless laugh, and for the first time the cracks in her composure began to show. "You mean the color of my skin?" she said, her voice flat, emotionless. A few guests stirred, uncomfortable. Some shifted in their seats, as if wishing they could disappear into the woodwork, pretending they were not witnessing what was unfolding before them. Others kept their gazes fixed forward, tense and unmoving, either too afraid or too indifferent to intervene. Father Michael had always known the weight of prejudice, had seen its poison seep into families, into friendships, into institutions built on faith and love. But rarely had he seen it weaponized with such quiet, unwavering resolve. He turned his gaze back to Robert, giving him one last chance to refute the claim, to soften, to back down. But Robert remained impassive. Elizabeth, on the other hand, finally moved. She stood, smoothing out the fabric of her dress with deliberate care, as though ensuring she still appeared perfectly put together, a portrait of grace and dignity. "You may twist our words however you wish," she said, her tone sharp, clipped. "But this marriage will be a mistake. It is a mistake. And if Thomas is too blinded by his infatuation to see that, then we must be the ones to open his eyes." Father Michael's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against him, waiting to see how he would respond. His role had always been clear: to stand as a guide, a voice of wisdom in moments of doubt. He had counseled many couples before their vows, had asked them to consider their love carefully, to ensure they were ready for the trials that marriage inevitably brought. But he had never stood before a couple who had to defend their very right to be together. His next words would shape what happened next. He turned to Thomas. "You have heard what has been said." His voice was gentle but firm. "This is a moment that will define the path ahead of you. I need to ask you, are you certain? Is this the life you choose?" Amanda's breath hitched ever so slightly, her fingers tensing. Thomas said nothing. Seconds passed. He looked at Amanda, his gaze flickering with something unreadable: pain, hesitation, doubt. Father Michael watched the battle unfold within him, a war between love and loyalty, between the life he had imagined and the weight of the family that had shaped him. And then, just as it seemed the silence would stretch forever, Thomas finally spoke. "I love her," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Relief flickered across Amanda's face, just for a moment. But then he swallowed, turning his gaze downward. "But I don't know if I can do this." The church exhaled all at once, a rush of murmurs, of whispers, of shifting bodies leaning in to see what would happen next. Amanda's grip on the bouquet loosened. Her shoulders slumped, barely perceptible, but enough that Father Michael saw it. Enough that he knew. She had expected this too. Thomas turned back to his parents. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "I want to be with her," he said, his voice uneven, "but I don't want to lose you." Robert's expression remained unchanged, but Elizabeth's mouth curved into the smallest hint of satisfaction. Amanda's lips parted, as though she wanted to say something, but no words came. Father Michael closed his eyes for a brief moment. This was what he had feared. Thomas had come here believing love alone was enough. But now, faced with the stark reality of what it would cost him, he hesitated. And in that hesitation, something fragile was beginning to crack. Father Michael straightened his shoulders, inhaling slowly. He would not rush this moment, but he knew one thing for certain. This wedding could not move forward. Not yet. The stillness in the church was no longer one of quiet reverence, but of something else entirely. It was the kind of silence that follows a revelation so devastating that no one knows how to react. It was the silence that came when love and duty stood at an impasse, and no one was willing to take the next step forward. Father Michael felt the weight of it pressing against his chest as he surveyed the faces before him. He had officiated countless weddings in this very church, had seen the nervous excitement of couples standing before him, eager to begin their lives together. But never had he seen a moment like this, a moment in which the very foundation of a marriage was being torn apart before it had even begun. Thomas stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his gaze shifting between his bride and his parents, as if he were caught in some invisible battle with himself. His words still hung in the air, lingering like the final chords of a song that had ended too soon. I want to be with her, but I don't want to lose you. Amanda had not moved. She stood in her wedding gown, still and poised, but there was something different in the way she held herself now. Before, there had been tension, an unspoken wariness, the quiet fortitude of a woman bracing for rejection. Now, that tension had settled into something colder, something sharper. Not anger, not quite, but understanding. She had always known this was a possibility. She had always known that Thomas's love, while deep, might not be enough to break the chains that bound him to the expectations of the people who had raised him. The guests shifted uncomfortably in the pews, glancing at one another with uncertain expressions. Some looked sympathetic, others merely fascinated, as if watching something unravel that was beyond their control. A few looked outright smug, as though they had anticipated this moment all along. Robert and Elizabeth remained where they were, their postures unmoving, their expressions unreadable, but the satisfaction in Elizabeth's eyes was unmistakable. Father Michael knew he had to act before this moment cemented itself into something permanent. He took a slow step forward, drawing the focus back to himself, reminding them all that this was not just a confrontation, but a ceremony that had been brought to a standstill. Marriage is not simply an agreement between two people, he said, his voice calm but firm. It is a union that must be built on trust, on love, on a willingness to stand together no matter the cost. His gaze flickered to Thomas, then to Amanda. I have asked you both if you are certain of your commitment to one another, but commitment is not merely a promise spoken in front of witnesses. It is a choice, one that must be made not just today, but every day that follows. Amanda met his gaze, and for the first time he saw something flicker in her expression, a quiet, weary gratitude. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat bobbing with the weight of something he could not quite name. But before I can continue with this ceremony, Father Michael continued, his tone gentle but unyielding, I must ask again. Thomas, do you take Amanda to be your wife, to stand beside her, to love her, to choose her above all else? The church seemed to hold its breath. Thomas hesitated. The hesitation was brief, so brief that perhaps only Amanda and Father Michael noticed it, but it was there. A beat of silence, an intake of breath, the way his eyes darted, just for a moment, toward his parents. And that moment was enough. Amanda saw it. And the understanding that passed over her face then was not a realization. It was confirmation. She had waited long enough. Slowly, deliberately, she uncurled her fingers from the bouquet she had been clutching all this time. The flowers, still pristine, still perfect, trembled slightly as she lowered them to her side. Then, with the same grace that had carried her down the aisle, she turned. Not toward Thomas, toward Robert and Elizabeth. The entire church seemed to draw in a breath. For the first time since she had stepped into this building, Amanda looked at them fully, her dark eyes steady, her chin lifted, her posture unyielding. I have spent so much time wondering if I would ever be enough for you, she said, her voice quiet but carrying through the church with the force of something unshakable. I have asked myself if there was anything I could do, anything I could say, that would make you see me as something more than the thing you refuse to accept." She took a single step closer, her heels clicking softly against the stone floor. "But I understand now that it was never about me." Her eyes did not waver. "It was about you, about what you refuse to let go of, about what you fear losing if you open your world to something different." Elizabeth's lips parted just slightly. "But I will not spend my life fighting for a place in a family that has already decided it does not want me." She exhaled slowly, as if shedding something she had carried for far too long. "I love your son," she said, and for the first time her voice wavered, not with doubt, but with something softer, something mournful. "But I love myself, too." And then, finally, she turned to Thomas. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. There was no anger in her expression, no hatred, no accusations, only sadness. Sadness for what could have been. Sadness for the man she loved, who was still bound by a love he could not untangle himself from. Thomas opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. And then Amanda stepped back, gently placing her bouquet onto the altar. She turned, and she walked away. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Father Michael closed his eyes for the briefest moment. The ceremony was over. But what had been broken in that church that day, what had been exposed, would not be forgotten. The heavy wooden doors of the church swung shut behind Amanda, leaving behind a room filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. The silence that followed her departure was not the stunned quiet of a momentary shock, nor was it the soft hush of reverence. It was a silence that pressed into the ribs of every person present, thick and unmoving, as though the very air had changed in quality. For a long moment, no one spoke. No one moved. Thomas stood in the same place where she had left him, his posture rigid, his fingers still curled as though reaching for something that was no longer there. His face was unreadable, not the stoic mask of a man too proud to show emotion, but the lost, bewildered expression of someone who had never believed this could truly happen. Someone who had never considered, not really, that she might walk away before he had the chance to do the same. The guests sat in varying degrees of discomfort. Some looked away, suddenly fascinated by the candlelit alcoves of the church or the delicate patterns in the stained glass. Others stared openly at Thomas, waiting for a reaction, as if the weight of the moment depended on him acknowledging it. A few exchanged quiet murmurs, voices hushed but unmistakable in their curiosity, their intrigue. And then, finally, movement. Robert exhaled slowly through his nose and adjusted the cuffs of his pristine suit. The sound was soft, barely audible, but in the heavy stillness of the church it carried. It was the sound of a man who had won. Elizabeth sat beside him, her posture elegant, her face serene. She did not look at Thomas, nor at the door through which Amanda had left. She merely smoothed the fabric of her dress and clasped her hands together in her lap, as though settling into a comfortable inevitability. Father Michael watched them both, a slow realization curling in his chest like smoke. They had expected this. Perhaps not this exact moment, not this precise unfolding of events, but they had always believed that, in the end, Amanda would not stay. That the weight of their presence, their disapproval, their unspoken conditions would be too much, that she would be the one to break, to walk away, leaving their son to return to them alone, as he always had. They had not fought, they had not raged, because they had never believed they needed to. Father Michael looked at Thomas, watching the slow unraveling of his expression, the way his hands finally relaxed at his sides, fingers trembling. His shoulders, once stiff with tension, slumped ever so slightly, as though he had just realized how much he had been holding. For years, he had been a man torn between two worlds, the one he had been raised in and the one he had built for himself. He had always believed he could merge them, that love would be enough to bridge the space between them. He had believed that if he simply waited long enough, if he showed them, if he proved it, his parents would come to accept what he had chosen. But love was not always enough. And in that moment, as he stood in the space where Amanda had once been, he finally saw it for what it was. She had not left because she did not love him. She had left because he had given her no choice. Because when she had needed him to choose her, to reach for her first, to stand beside her and show the world that she was not alone, he had hesitated, even for just a moment. And that moment had been enough. The realization must have struck him like a physical blow because suddenly he moved. Without a word, without warning, he turned and strode past the altar, past the rows of silent, watching guests toward the church doors. His mother called his name, sharp and clipped, but he did not stop. His father spoke next, his voice steady and commanding. "Thomas." It was not a question. It was a warning. But Thomas did not turn. Father Michael did not move to stop him. He had known Thomas since he was a boy, had watched him grow into the man standing before him now, and he knew there were some lessons that could not be taught by words alone. Some realizations could only come in the wake of something broken. The heavy doors groaned as Thomas shoved them open, and then, just like Amanda, he was gone. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Robert let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly, as though considering whether this was something worth standing for. He remained seated. Elizabeth did not turn. And the ceremony that never was came to an end. No applause, no celebration, only the sound of whispered voices, murmuring through the vaulted ceilings like wind through the rafters. The cool afternoon air hit Thomas like a wave the moment he stepped outside. The shift from the stifling atmosphere of the church to the open world beyond its doors was almost dizzying, the contrast between the two spaces sharp and undeniable. Inside, everything had felt suffocating. Tight walls, weighted gazes, the crushing silence of disappointment. But here, beneath the pale stretch of sky, the world seemed vast, infinite, untouched by the quiet destruction that had just unfolded behind him. Amanda was nowhere in sight. For a moment, he simply stood there, breath unsteady, heart still hammering from the realization that had struck him too late. He had never thought it would happen like this, had never truly considered the possibility that she might be the one to walk away first. Some naive part of him had always believed that if there was a breaking point, it would be his to decide. That if anyone hesitated, if anyone faltered, it would be him. But she had left without waiting for his answer. And now, for the first time since this day had begun, since the ceremony had unraveled around them like a tapestry coming undone, Thomas was forced to acknowledge the truth. She had always been waiting for him to be ready, waiting for him to choose, and he had failed her. The realization settled like lead in his stomach. His parents had won, not because they had convinced him, not because they had forced him to abandon the woman he loved, but because they had planted doubt in him so deeply that for just one moment he had let it take root. That moment had cost him everything. A sharp gust of wind stirred the trees lining the churchyard, rustling the leaves in a sound that might have been mistaken for whispers. The parking lot beyond the gate was mostly empty now. Some guests had already begun to leave, slipping away in the wake of the disaster, not wanting to linger too long in the discomfort of it all. Amanda must have left quickly, or perhaps she had simply known he wouldn't follow. The thought sent a new wave of nausea rolling through him. He had to find her. His feet moved before the thought was fully formed, carrying him down the church steps with quick, uneven strides. His pulse roared in his ears as he reached for his phone, but when he tried to dial her number, his fingers hesitated over the screen. What could he say? What could possibly be enough to undo what had just happened? He had hesitated in front of everyone. He had hesitated in front of her. And now, standing in the open air, free from the suffocating pressure of his family's expectations, he could see the moment with perfect clarity. The way she had looked at him when she turned to leave, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with the quiet, devastating understanding of someone who had hoped, one last time, and found nothing left to hope for. She had given him the chance to prove that he would stand beside her. And he had done nothing. The weight of it sent him staggering to a stop near the curb, chest tight, throat burning with something dangerously close to grief. How had he let this happen? How had he not seen it coming? The voice in his head sounded disturbingly like his father's. This was inevitable. No. Thomas clenched his jaw, shoving the thought away with everything he had. This wasn't inevitable. It had never been inevitable. His parents had wanted him to believe that, had spent months slowly feeding him the idea that this was doomed from the start, that no matter how much he loved Amanda, no matter how much she loved him, there were things that could never change. But they had been wrong. The only person who had let this happen was him. He had given them power over his choices, had let their doubt poison him, had allowed their silence to weigh heavier than his own love. And now Amanda was gone. His breath hitched, the sheer finality of that thought threatening to send him reeling all over again. No, he wouldn't let this be the end. He wouldn't let them be right. Without another moment's hesitation, Thomas turned toward the parking lot, scanning the rows of vehicles, searching for any sign of her. She had to still be here. She couldn't have gone far. He ignored the guests who were staring at him now, the murmurs rippling through the crowd as they watched the groom, alone, moving with the desperate urgency of a man who had just realized what he stood to lose. Then he saw it. A black car near the far edge of the lot, idling just before the exit. Amanda sat in the back seat, her profile barely visible through the tinted glass. Thomas didn't think. He ran. His dress shoes skidded slightly against the pavement as he crossed the lot, his heart hammering in his chest. The car was beginning to move. He reached it just as it neared the exit, slapping his hand against the back window, breathless, frantic. The car slowed, and for a single, unbearable moment, there was silence. Then the window rolled down. Amanda turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable, her eyes tired. Thomas felt his throat close. He had no right to ask her to stay, no right to undo what had already been broken, but he had to try. He had to tell her, before it was too late, before he lost her forever, before the last chance he had to prove himself slipped through his fingers like sand. The car idled at the edge of the parking lot, its engine humming softly against the heavy silence. Amanda sat motionless in the back seat, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers still curled slightly from where they had once held the bouquet she had left behind. She didn't look at Thomas immediately. Instead, she stared ahead at the road stretching before her, at the path leading away from everything she had just walked out of. Thomas stood beside the open window, breathless, his pulse roaring in his ears. He had run after her, had stopped her before she could leave, but now that she was here, now that she had given him this one last moment, he found himself struggling for words. Amanda turned her head at last, her expression calm, distant. Not cold, but careful. "Say what you need to say," she murmured. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't sharp with accusation or heavy with grief. If anything, it was quiet, resigned, like she already knew what he was going to say, like she had already lived through this conversation in her mind and had made peace with whatever was coming. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hesitated, dragging a hand through his hair before letting it fall uselessly to his side. "I was wrong." Amanda's expression didn't change. "I was wrong to let them control me," he continued, the words tumbling out now, frantic, desperate. "I was wrong to hesitate. I was wrong to make you feel like I wasn't choosing you. I never should have." She held up a hand, stopping him. "You were scared," she said simply. He looked at her, startled. Amanda exhaled softly, finally meeting his gaze fully. "I knew that when I walked into that church. I've known it for a long time." Thomas shook his head. "That doesn't make it okay." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." Silence stretched between them, filled with everything they weren't saying. Thomas clenched his jaw, his hands tightening at his sides. "I love you," he said, and this time his voice was steady. "That never changed. I need you to know that." Amanda studied him for a long moment. "I know you love me," she said at last. That was never the question. The answer hit him harder than he expected. Because she was right. That had never been the question. The question had always been whether he was strong enough to love her the way she deserved to be loved. Whether he could stand beside her, not just in the quiet moments, but in the difficult ones. Whether he could love her openly, fully, without hesitation, without fear. And in the moment that had mattered most, he had failed. "You waited for me to prove that I could fight for you," Thomas said, his voice low, "and I didn't." Amanda didn't answer right away. She turned her gaze back toward the road, watching as the wind swayed through the trees. "You fought," she murmured, "just not hard enough." The words weren't cruel, they weren't meant to wound, but they did, because they were true. She sighed, leaning back slightly against the seat. "You always wanted to believe that your love for me and your love for them could coexist, that there was a way to make it work without losing either. But, Thomas..." She turned back to him, and for the first time her voice wavered slightly. "Some things don't fit together. Some choices can't be shared." Thomas swallowed against the lump rising in his throat. "I know," he whispered. Amanda nodded faintly, her expression softening, not with forgiveness, but with understanding. She reached for the door handle. Thomas felt his heart pound, the instinctive panic surging through him, screaming at him to stop her, to beg her to stay. But he didn't, because he understood now. She wasn't leaving because she didn't love him. She wasn't leaving because she wanted to. She was leaving because she had to. For herself. Amanda pushed the door open and stepped out onto the pavement. She stood before him, her white dress flowing gently in the afternoon breeze, no longer a symbol of the day they had planned, but a ghost of what could have been. She lifted her hand, fingertips grazing his lightly, a touch so fleeting it barely existed at all. And then she let go. Thomas closed his eyes. When he opened them, she was walking away. She didn't look back. The car door shut behind her, the driver waiting only a moment before pulling onto the road. The vehicle disappeared down the street, swallowed by the curve of the trees, leaving nothing behind but the fading sound of tires against asphalt. Thomas stood motionless, staring at the empty road long after she was gone. The church bells rang in the distance. Inside, guests were leaving, murmuring among themselves, shaking hands, exchanging knowing glances. The ceremony had ended, and soon this day would become something people whispered about, a story told in hushed voices over dinner tables and late-night phone calls. His parents would consider it a victory. His friends would offer quiet sympathy, and Amanda would move forward, away from all of it, away from him. Thomas inhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling deep in his bones. He had lost her. And for the first time he understood that it wasn't just because of what had happened today. It had happened long before that. Slowly, gradually, in every moment he had let doubt creep in, in every silence he had let linger, in every instance he had believed that love alone would be enough to bridge the gap between two worlds. It had never been about love. It had always been about choice. And today, for the first time, he had made one. He turned towards the church, toward the building that had once felt like home, toward the place where he had thought his future would begin. But as he stood there beneath the high stone arches and towering stained glass windows, he realized something. This was no longer his home. Not anymore. Without another glance at the church, at the guests, at the life that had been chosen for him, Thomas turned and walked away. This time, he did not hesitate. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share this video with your friends and let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're looking for more captivating stories, check out the next video or explore others on the channel. See you soon.